Welcome back. Across the United States, many women and children continue to endure the horrors of forced marriages. Forced marriage is recognized globally as a form of modern slavery and as a harmful practice that disempowers women and girls. Founder and executive director of Unchained at Last, Fraidy Reiss, joins me to discuss the fight to end forced and child marriages. Fraidy, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
Now, this may come as a shock to many Americans. It definitely, was a shock to me. But forced and child marriages are still legal in several states throughout, our country. Can you give an overview of this occurrence in the United States?
Actually, it's legal in most of the United States, forced and child marriage. So we have very few laws and policies in place to punish or prevent forced marriage and also child marriage or marriage before age 18, which is a form of forced marriage, remains legal in 37 US states. So it's happening across the US. In terms of forced marriage, we don't have numbers on that, but we know that child marriage or marriage before 18 is impacting hundreds of thousands of minors. Of more than 300,000 children were married in the United States since the year 2000, some as young as 10 years old, and almost all of them are girls married to adult men.
Now, can you talk about Unchained at Last and how it addresses this issue?
Yeah, we at Unchained, so we're a survivor led nonprofit. I founded this organization out of my own traumatic experience. I grew up right here in New York City, but in a very insular religious, fundamentalist religious community where forced and child marriage remain the norm. And from my experience, after I managed to escape after 15 years trapped in an abusive forced marriage to a stranger, well, he started out as a stranger before he became my abuser. After I managed to rebuild my life, I founded Unchained at Last, and we are combating forced and child marriage using a two pronged approach. First of all, direct services. We are here to support survivors as they are escaping from one of these nightmarish situations. And then at the same time, we're working on systems change. We're determined to promote social policy and legal change with the ultimate goal of putting ourselves out of business.
Now, can you, tell me a little bit more about what happens to the victims or survivors of these marriages and who is most likely affected by this?
Well, to answer your second question first, this is happening everywhere across the United States. This is not happening only in New York. Obviously, this is a national problem, and it's not happening only in my former religious community. This is happening, from what we can see, in every community, culture, religion, every ethnicity, every socioeconomic level. This is a very widespread problem. And to be clear, a forced marriage is not just the trauma of that wedding, of an unwanted wedding. It's not just the trauma of wedding night rape, which is inevitable with a forced marriage. It's a lifetime of this affair and rape and abuse. And in many cases, what it also means, what we are seeing, is forced marital sex, otherwise known as rape, and therefore forced parenthood. So, for example, I was forced to have unprotected sex with my husband, not only on my wedding night, but on a monthly basis. And it was time for when I was ovulating. So, when you're forced to have unprotected sex every time you ovulate, what happens? You're also forced to become a parent. So, I was forced to have two children without my consent. And this is something that we see again and again. I was also forced to become completely financially dependent on my husband. I was not allowed to have my own bank account, credit card, any kind of income or money. And this is again something that we see across the board. Forced domestic servitude. We're talking about a lifetime of hell.
Now, what role, does the family play in all of this?
Well, one of the really sad uh, aspects of this, obviously, there are no happy aspects to forced marriage, but one of the really devastating aspects is the fact that when someone is forced to marry, their own parent almost always plays a crucial role in facilitating it. And that means, in addition to the trauma and the harm and the abuse that I was describing before that somebody in a forced marriage experiences, there is also that added element of the betrayal. There's a betrayal from family. And in addition to the emotional harm that that brings, think about also how difficult that makes escape. Typically, if somebody's in a terrible situation, they would turn to their own family for support, for some help in getting out. You can't do that when your own family is the one that did that to you. So it also makes escape extremely, extremely difficult. You think about a domestic violence situation where we know that escape is never easy in a domestic violence situation. But in a more classic, I hate to use that word, but in a domestic violence situation outside of forced marriage, typically what we see is that there's one perpetrator in many cases. So if we remove that one perpetrator from the home, the rest of the family can achieve some level of safety. When we're talking about a forced marriage, the only way for a survivor to get to safety is there's no one perpetrator. That even if the husband or that one parent who's doing it is gone, there's a whole rest of the family, and in many cases a community also that will step in to enforce. So really the only way for that person to get to safety is for them to be removed.
Now, could you highlight the differences between forced marriage and what many of us, are familiar with, arranged marriages? How are they differ, and are they both just as harmful?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the difference between a forced marriage and an arranged marriage is supposed to be the difference between coercion and consent. In an arranged marriage, they both parties agree, they consent to having their marriage arranged. And in a forced marriage, that means one or both parties do not give full free consent. The problem is there's such a fine line between coercion and consent. So, in like my situation, for example, I was groomed from infancy to accept an arranged marriage to a stranger. I didn't know anyone who hadn't had that exact experience, including my own parents and siblings and friends and neighbors. There was no one else who had not had their marriage arranged. The, the idea of saying no was so far fetched. There was no real no for me. So our concern at Unchained is that no family or community likes to say we practice forced marriage because that sounds terrible, and forced marriage is recognized as a form of modern slavery and as a human rights abuse. But labeling something arranged marriage when it's actually forced marriage, that doesn't make it okay. And that we just want to make sure that there aren't families hiding behind the label of arranged marriage when we know what we're looking at as a forced marriage.
Now, I really want to talk about, as you mentioned, it's recognized globally as a form of modern slavery. Unfortunately, many states are trying to block any sort of, bill or anything to protect a lot of the people who are affected by this. I understand in Missouri there was recently, you know, a move to block uh, just a way to end this. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the legislation that we've been going state by state to push is legislation that's aimed specifically at child marriage, which is one form of forced marriage, a particularly nefarious form of forced marriage, where it's one or both parties are under the age of 18. And because minors do not have basic legal rights of adulthood, for child marriage is recognized as forced marriage because they cannot say no to a marriage since they're not even allowed to leave home or in many cases file for divorce. They can't get into a domestic violence shelter. So any marriage involving a minor is by definition a forced marriage. And the simple solution is to make the marriage age 18, no exceptions, something we have convinced so far 13 states, including New York, to pass. But in the other 37 states, we continue to hit major resistance. And as you said, in Missouri, just last week, we came up against legislators who said they refuse to pass this simple common sense legislation that costs nothing. It harms no one except child rapists, and it ends this human rights abuse and form of modern slavery that entraps mostly girls across the United States, and in this case in Missouri. And no good reason for it. It's just a lack of concern about girls. There's no one who's harmed by this. Why would you not pass this legislation? And one of the really evil arguments that legislators in Missouri use is they're so concerned that if we end child marriage, that it's going to encourage girls to have an abortion because if they get pregnant and they can't get married, they're going to have an abortion. First of all, where did this even come from? And there are no studies that show that ending child marriage has any impact on abortion rates. If anything, it probably decreases it, since it probably decreases teenage pregnancy rates. Besides, it's almost impossible to get an abortion in Missouri. Legislators have made sure that a woman or a girl in Missouri has almost no possible way to get an abortion. So, what are you talking about? How would ending child marriage increase teenage abortion rates when a teen right now who needs an abortion can't even get one?
Now, what can people do, those who are listening, those who will listen and learn about, this horror that's happening right here, in our country? What can people do to ensure that this ends and, or to support, organizations like yours that are fighting to end this?
Well, there this is one of those things where we can end child marriage in the United States. All we have to do is make sure that all 50 states pass the same legislation that 13 states have passed so far to make the marriage age 18, no exceptions. And I encourage everyone to go to unchainedatLast.org to see how you can help make sure that this legislation passes across all 50 US states. Under the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the United States promised to end child marriage by year 2030. Let's make sure the United States keeps that promise. So unchained.last.org, you can see how you can help make that happen.
Now, what resources does your organization also provide for those who are survivors of this?
We provide crucial, comprehensive wraparound support services, all kinds of legal, social, and financial services, and emotional support to those who are escaping an impending forced marriage, escaping an existing forced marriage, and rebuilding their lives after escape. And we do not charge for any of our services. We are here to support people in that situation. So if you are in that situation or you know someone who is, please reach out to us. You deserve and can get help.
Well, Freddie, I want to thank you so much for joining us, sharing your story, and educating myself as well as our viewers about this. Prior to even getting ready for this, this was not something that I even would have could imagine is happening, around myself and around the people that I know. So, once again, I just wanted to thank you for having the courage to do the work that you're doing, and just supporting those who need that support and educating people once again. So, thank you.
Well, and thank you for shining a spotlight on this.
To learn more about Fraidy's fight to end forced and child marriages in the U.S., please go to their website at unchained.last.org. Stay tuned, we have more open for you right after this.